Prvi put u istoriji Srbija je bila domaćin Evropske asocijacije kognitivno-bihevioralnih psihoterapeuta. Iako naziv asocijacije sadrži reč evropski, događaj je okupio terapeute iz celog sveta. Više od 1000 učesnika i oko 30 plenarnih predavača učinili su ovaj skup nezabeleženim do sada. Ovaj izuzetno veliki odziv nedvosmisleno ukazuje na rastuće interesovanje za brzu i efikasnu psihoterapiju, kao i na potrebu za razmenom iskustava, posebno u post-covid periodu, kada su posledice na mentalno zdravlje postale očigledne.
Kognitivno-bihevioralna terapija nastala je kao spoj bihevioralne terapije.
U prethodnoj emisiji bavili smo se nastankom i osnovnim principima kognitivno-bihevioralne terapije, njenom naučnom utemeljenošću, dokazima o efikasnosti, kao i ličnim razlozima zbog kojih se mnogi terapeuti odlučuju baš za ovaj pravac.
Working for more than 40 years on the treatment of anxiety problems, developing new treatments, and then trying to roll those out for the people who really need them. The reasons that I do cognitive behavior therapy is because I started my career in psychology at a time when there was very little evidence. The first stage of evidence in psychotherapy was behavior therapy, and the other psychotherapists quite angry about this, that we were claiming to have evidence and so on. Now that was an evolution really between behavior therapy and cognitive therapy. And again, it was both evidence-based and empirically grounded. And what that evidence-based means is that the treatments can be shown to be effective in randomized controlled trials.
The research that we have has demonstrated that cognitive behavioral interventions, therapies that change the way we think and directly try to change the way we behave, are the most effective interventions. Lots of other psychotherapies have never really been tested with anger. It's like people don't want to, I don't know, maybe they would work, but people haven't tested them. Or maybe the people who do those kinds of therapies don't think that they would work. But cognitive behavior therapy clearly is the thing that works the best.
Današnju emisiju započinjemo predstavljanjem 2 istraživanja koje su sprovedena pre početka COVID pandemije, a koja su se bavila psihoterapijskim intervencijama u situacijama kolektivne neizvesnosti i prirodnih katastrofa.
For a number of years we've been using CBT to target uncertainty and anxiety disorders, but when the pandemic came along we had to think about what's the same and what's the difference between a real-world situation and anxiety disorders. So some of the things that we knew from working with anxiety disorders could apply, but when people were distressed during the pandemic, that's not an anxiety disorder, that's just a reaction to everyday life. And so we had to come up with some newer ways of addressing some of the features of uncertainty in that situation. So when people are very distressed about real-life situations, one of the things that became very obvious is that a lot of people were doing a lot of information seeking online, and they were essentially trying to find answers to questions that nobody had the answer to. And because no one had the answer to, they'd look further and further, and then they would find unhelpful answers, and they would just keep searching, and they'd get overwhelmed by a lot of information that was either simply not there, was inaccurate, or was actually deliberately misinforming or disinforming for other people's own needs. So one of the things we did that was helpful was to help people realize that, first of all, there's only some information that might be accurate, but that's only accurate today. And it doesn't mean to say necessarily that there is a conspiracy or that other people have the answers or that we may not have an answer yet. And so helping people figure out what information they needed and where were the places to look for it, and so reduce the amount of unhelpful information they were getting would certainly decrease people's distress. And to rebalance that, we encouraged people to look about what was happening in their community, what was happening locally. So in the pandemic, we had what was happening in the world and what was happening nationally, and that was all bad news. But if you changed your focus to local communities, what people would find out is that a lot of community life was still continuing. Children were winning prizes, animals were being rescued, And so it was a completely different impression of how life was. So switching people's attention from lots of unhelpful information and telling us all the things we don't know to actually find out what's happening, it was certainly one way we could help people.
Jedan od predavača koji je izazvao veliko interesovanje, ali i pobudio oprečna mišljenja o inovacijama u KBT-u je James Bennett Levy, profesor na Southern Cross univerzitetu u Australiji, edukator, istraživač, koautor 5 knjiga i predavač u 27 zemalja, među kojima se našla i Srbija.
I'm talking about a clinical trial that I have been funded by the Australian government to undertake. That clinical trial is for people who have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as a result of a disaster. Specifically in the region where I live, this region has been severely flooded twice in the past 5 years. So we became probably the first center in the world to research a disaster-affected community that then became re-disastered 5 years later. And so the second time around, with this much more major disaster, we're able to say, we know that there are going to be thousands of people with PTSD as a result of this flood. What are we going to do about it? So we constructed a treatment package for people who've been flood affected. And so that's a partly CBT package, partly what's called compassion-focused therapy package, and partly psychedelic-assisted therapy package.
U istoriji psihoterapije poznat je pokušaj upotrebe psihoaktivnih supstanci u lečenju depresije, anksioznosti i posttraumatskog stresnog poremećaja. Ovaj pristup počeo je da se razvija 50. godina prošlog veka, ali zbog zloupotrebe i niza društveno-političkih implikacija bio je zabranjen 15 godina kasnije. Interesovanje za lečenjem psiholoških problema psihodelicima ponovo se vraća u 21. veku. Ovoga puta kroz, kako ističu, pažljiviji pristup.
I personally have got interested in that area over the last 4 or 5 years, and so I've done for myself quite a lot of training to become a psychedelic-assisted therapist, and lately I've started training other people, and today was an example, to at least give them a taste of what this area involves. For me, I think it's an absolute paradigm shift, if that makes sense, in terms of therapy. So we haven't really had any big innovations in psychotherapy. In the last 40 years, we've had different kinds of therapy being developed. But what we've learned about psychedelic-assisted therapy so far is that the psychedelics can provide insights and experiences which it could take tens, if not hundreds, of therapy sessions to get to. But the medicine, the psychedelics, enable those insights. Now, what I also need to say about that is that those insights are nothing without the therapy. For instance, say that you've been depressed and you in your psychedelic session, you kind of hear maybe just an internal voice, but it might be an external voice as well. Just the level of self-criticism, of shame, of self-disgust, self-loathing in your internal dialogue. I'm a terrible person, I'm worthless, here I am, I've made an absolute mess of things again, I'm, useless, I need to, my wife needs to leave me, I'm hopeless, da da da. In the psychedelic session, you can almost sort of be there and kind of experience this in a really quite an extreme way maybe, but there's another part of you in the psychedelic session that will be looking at this and saying, hey, this is a really unkind way to treat myself, really unkind. And if I go on treating myself like this, is that going to be good for me, for my relationship with my wife, for my relationships with my kids, for my future work capacity? Is this a good way to treat myself? And so you get that insight not only kind of like, you know, just from a thinking level, but the psychedelics actually give it to you in your body. It's like, it becomes a real thing. It's like, I can see this in the core of my being, that this is what I'm doing to myself.
Jako mi je zanimljivo to što se na ovoj konferenciji priča i o terapiji psihodelicima, pošto se tim bavim i iz naučne perspektive, zapravo samo iz naučne perspektive, zato što psihodelici nisu legalni kod nas i ne postoji način da se bavimo time drugačije. Ali zanimljivo je da je bilo 2 predavanja o tome, da je to prostor, da se dalo prostor toj temi i nadam se da će što više da se daje prostor toj temi, jer naučni dokazi, ne dokazi, ali nauka pokazuje da je to široko polje koje treba dati perspektivu.
Zanimljivo je da u Srbiji postoji Nacionalna asocijacija za istraživanje psihodelika, koja okuplja ljude različitih zanimanja, psihijatre, psihologe, neurologe, biologe, antropologe. S druge strane, postoji snažan otpor prema ovom pristupu koji se smatra stramputicom u psihoterapiji. Ipak, konferencija u Beogradu je bila dovoljno sveobuhvatna da predstavi različite terapijske pristupe i istraživanja. Među pristupima koji su predstavljeni bila je i avatar terapija, psihoterapija u kojoj se koristi virtuelna realnost i 3D modeli u cilju suočavanja pacijenata sa problemima, ali u sigurnom okruženju.
I am Italian representative of my association, which is the Cognitive-Behavior Therapy Society. The name is SITCH, and I am a director of a rehabilitation unit in my department of mental health, and I teach CBT in CBT school, and I've been professor at the University of Bologna of psychotherapy. I am involved in the research and clinical research and application of technologies and CBT techniques in CBT in schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a very severe disease which was considered until years ago a chronic disease, which includes delusions, hallucination, social withdrawal, cognitive impairment, metacognitive deficit. It's a very severe disease. It's considered one of the most important psychiatric diseases and very difficult to treat. 20, 30 years ago, it was considered mainly treated only by pharmacological treatment. But nowadays, after years of research and studies from literature, we know that also psychotherapies could be useful for this kind of patient. In particular, CBT could be very useful in managing better delusions, hallucinations, and in helping people to live better and working on some specific domain. So the CBT therapies has been proven to be an efficacy instrument to be added to the pharmacological treatment. And nowadays the challenge is to try to avoid that this patient become chronic with early intervention at the onset, or trying to prevent the shift from the state of being in at-risk mental state to psychotic one. The new updates are coming from introduction of technology, which it seems could give a help to improve the psychotherapies.
In which way?
In which way? For instance, we are developing the interaction, the introducing of virtual reality and avatar therapy to manage delusions and hallucination and to help patients to cope better with their own voices. I'm talking about the avatar, which is a reproduction, is a digital, at the computer of course, reproduction of his voices. And in this way we can help a patient to face better with his own symptoms. This is the avatar therapy.
Savremeni razvoj tehnologije našao je široku primjenu u psihoterapiji. Na konferenciji u Beogradu razgovaralo se o tome na koji način se tehnologija koristi u pružanju psihološke podrške i koliko je efikasna u tom procesu.
There are quite a few well-established online, reasonably interactive versions of therapy, and these are quite well established because it started with a book and then it was a book online and then it was something that was more interactive. So that's been a development of standard therapy through to what we would call gamified. So it's actually delivering interventions that are based on what therapists would do. And so there is some good evidence for some of those. Chatbots is still quite early, so those which are based on AI, this is still very new. I think it has a lot of potential, but it's only as good as the information that's being fed in and the algorithms that are being used.
U Velikoj Britaniji, na primjer, koriste se različiti kompjuterski programi i aplikacije kako bi što veći broj ljudi mogao da dobije neophodnu psihološku pomoć.
It can be online, group work. It can be computerized, so you have a computerized package and you do a bit of work online and then the therapist rings you a week later to see how you've got on, and it can be face-to-face. So there's various ways in which you can access a therapist. So in England, I'll give you an example, is people can access therapy for free. So it's called the step care model. So you see a doctor, then you might see a low-intensity CBT worker. So that's more guided self-help. You see somebody for 20 or 30 minutes, they give you information, then you can go away and practice. So, and then you see people for more high intensity, maybe counselling or cognitive behavioural therapy, psychotherapy. So it's more sessions, maybe an hour long per week, but it's free, which is really important because we know from data and research that people from poorer backgrounds are more likely to have poorer mental health. So we need to be able to help those people as well.
I pre pandemije, a naročito posle, postalo je jasno da je neophodno omogućiti veću dostupnost psihoterapiji, i to ne samo zbog psihičkog zdravlja, već i zbog ekonomske dobrobiti.
About 14 years ago, a special project was launched which was called IAPT, or Improving Access to Psychological Therapy. So that project was to train a lot of therapists. I mean, they trained, in the end, many thousands of therapists to set up services which people could access themselves. And the point of these services, the therapists were trained to offer evidence-based treatment. So that could be cognitive behavior therapy, could be other therapies, some types of counselling for some types of depression. But it was to follow the NICE guidelines. These are the guidelines that are produced independently to say what is effective and what isn't.
I come from a very working class background in a very deprived part of the country. And then when I graduated and went back, I couldn't find a job, I couldn't find voluntary work. And then this opportunity came up to work for the National Health Service in the Improving Access to Psychological Therapies initiative, which is now called the NHS Talking Therapies, which expanded the training of therapists. And that opportunity came up, and it was that opportunity that led me into the National Health Service, and then I stayed on and I worked and did low-intensity CBT, high-intensity CBT, mindfulness teacher training, and I just kept going there. I did my doctorate in clinical psychology, and so currently I'm in learning disability survey. So I'm thinking, how do we adapt what we do to a group of people that are often forgotten in society or in mental health?
That programme also measured what happened to patients. So each time the patient came, if they were depressed, they filled out a short depression scale, and they did that every session, so you could see if they're improving. And at the beginning in IAPT, the therapists were getting 30% recovery rates. Okay, now 30% is not what you'd expect. So what happened is that the therapists were then helped to improve their therapy. And so now the recovery rate for most problems is at 60%. So, and we're talking about literally 900,000 people per year being treated under the IAPT. It's been a big investment by the government. And the secret in terms of actually why this happened was very simple. It was an alliance between two professors of psychology. So my good friend David Clarke and another professor who's a man called Lord Richard Layard. Clarke is a psychologist, a clinical psychologist. Layard is an economist. And it was the economics. So Layard did very careful economic analysis, and he worked out that for every pound you spent on IAPT, you saved £9. So he basically told the government that if they did this, they could save money by doing good. And that indeed is what happened. What happened, it's amazing that actually we're delivering much more therapy to people, and those people, for example, are going back to work, and then when they go back to work, they start paying tax. They're not paid welfare. And those people who are still working, who have a mental health problem, they have two issues: absenteeism, time off sick, also presenteeism, at work and not doing very efficient work. And if you offer them treatment, they improve that. The other area that IAPT picked up on is something called long-term conditions. So these are problems like diabetes, asthma, and so on. And one of the things we know is if people have, let's take diabetes, that if you have diabetes and you're also depressed, your medical care, not the care for your depression, but the medical care, costs about 50% more than if you have diabetes, aren't depressed. If you treat the depression, the costs of the healthcare come down. And again, it pays for itself, usually within the first 6 months. So it's actually the economics that made the difference. And it was this alliance between a clinical psychologist and an economist that really made the difference. Other countries in the world are in fact picking this up. So it's now happening in Norway. And Norway has replicated this. Norway showed huge savings because people are very highly paid in Norway. The welfare system was well developed. So absolutely colossal savings. Japan and South Korea is picking it up. So there's actually a spread. I think there are 6 countries in the world which are modelling it. They have to adapt it because what works in England is not going to work in Korea. But the principles are the same, and the idea of relying on evidence-based therapies is super important in my view.
U cilju povećanja efikasnosti, tokom vremena razvijani su novi terapijski pravci koji se temelje na osnovnim principima kognitivno-bihevioralne terapije. Neki od prepoznatljivih pravaca koji su nastali iz KBT-a su dijalektičko-bihevioralna terapija, koja se fokusira na usklađivanje emocionalne stabilnosti s realističnim i konstruktivnim ponašanjem, kognitivna terapija zasnovana na mindfulnessu, terapija usmerena na prevenciju depresije, racionalno-emocionalno-bihevioralna terapija, koja akcenat stavlja na razotkrivanje iracionalnih uverenja i tako redom. Konferencija u Beogradu održana je pod nazivom Novo doba KBT-a. Pitali smo šta to označava.
Kognitivno-bihevioralna terapija je vrlo otvorena za integrisanje sa raznim drugim dobrim stvarima. Jednog dana vrlo je moguće da će se to samo zvati psihoterapija i da će biti, ako neko ima neki problem, znaće se kako treba da se radi s njim. Tako da ide se ka tome, ide se ka toj integraciji, a kognitivno-bihevioralna terapija je neko ko može da okupi sve druge terapije oko sebe.
In terms of the history of cognitive behavior therapy, this has been a steady evolutionary progression. But people quite like to say, oh, it's first wave, it's second wave, it's third wave. This is brand new, and so on. We have to forget the previous stuff. That is really unhelpful and is not what we do in any other field. We wouldn't say, hey, we have this new procedure in cardiology or oncology, cancer care, and so we're going to now do something completely different. By and large, what we do is we improve on what we have already. The so-called third wave is simply a repackaging. In English, we say, this is a case of old wine in new bottles.
Well, because of my own work around uncertainty and what everybody experienced and learnt in the pandemic, I would say the new era, it's the post-pandemic era. I think it's a challenging time, but it's also an exciting time. And because society in general and CBT in particular, we probably got 10 years of innovation done in a year. So there was so much innovation because we were forced to adapt. So I think the pandemic really showed how we can, how much innovation is possible.
Rastuća potreba za psihoterapijskom podrškom i nezamislivo brzi tehnološki razvoj koji iz korena menja način života, pa i psihoterapiju, donose veliki broj inovacija koje će biti predstavljene već na sledećem Evropskom kongresu KBT terapeuta, zakazanom za septembar 2025. u Glazgovu.